dance through the... Oh, whoa!
Hey, I'm going to be doing my last panel performance ever at PAX East this year. It's going to be Saturday at 8 o'clock at the Albatross Theater. You're not going to want to miss it. We're going to go out with a bang. It's like a big party. Hope to see you there. So Elden Ring is a fantastic game. I've been playing a ton of it. And while I've been playing it, I also been looking out of bounds, trying to find things that the players can't normally see. Now, I'm only covering areas of the game that don't spoil my playthrough of the game, so you're not going to see ending spoilers or anything like that. And I also want to thank Franz Booma for making this camera. You can get a link to his Patreon in the video description down below. And with that said, let's see all the interesting stuff that I found here. So although this isn't great for the content of my show, I'm wicked impressed. By that I mean, if I take the camera underneath the environment and stuff like that, you don't typically see a lot of things just hidden out of bounds or a lot of junk left over by the developers. Sometimes I get pretty impressed by the fact that you'll be in a small cave and just above that is still the entire environment loaded in. That isn't always the case in this game, but I'm used to even smaller caves in open world video games to load in any interior shots. But that's still not to say I haven't found anything. Lots of stuff inside of models and out of bounds, but one of the greatest things about covering Elden Ring on Boundary Break, a lot of the larger bosses move around sporadically and you don't get a chance to really appreciate the details of these models. And I'll tell you, they put in a ton of work into them. It's shocking that they don't in some way allow you to stop and smell the roses here. Like the Godskin Noble, at a glance, you might assume that he's just wearing cloth garb, but if you look really, really closely, his outfit is literally God's skin, with his cape in the back being a large belly with a sagging chest, his hood being a pair of ears and eyeballs, and his tabard being a collection of faces. And if we cause some invisibility here, you can even see that he has a massive belt. And sometimes there's just creatures that are way too small to ever stop and notice. And by taking the camera up to them, we could stop to appreciate some of the finer features on their face. For example, I thought that there was always an underbite here, but it's actually just flaps of skin around the mouth, but they do have fangs. And also with a lot of enemies, there is a little hint of an Erdtree on their armor or whatever else. Here's a great example of one on a staff, but even more surprising on this Sentinel, if you look at his helmet up close, you can see he has a literal tree on top of his head. It's not even an ornament, it's straight up a tree. Or with this mini boss here, if we take a close look at the ears and underneath the chin, there's ornate jewelry decorated on this model, which in my normal playthrough I was never able to notice because these enemies in particular zip around the map like crazy. And now we're going to take a look inside of some of these models. But before we get to that, let's talk about HelloFresh. Time is valuable, especially for those that are in adulthood. And HelloFresh is great because you don't have to go through all the aisles to find these nuanced ingredients for amazing dishes. Instead, it's all included into one shipped package. And on top of that, you don't have to overpay for ingredients, as HelloFresh generally includes the amount that you only need for your meal. They have over 50 meals to choose from at any given time, and they can tailor the meals to your specifications, like if you're a vegetarian, or if you're cooking for a family, or if you're looking for a diet option. Frankly, it's been pretty good for me because I'm very indecisive about what I want to actually cook, and I get in a rut of cooking the same stuff that I grew up with, but with HelloFresh, they provide options for me that I would never consider to make for myself. Use my link or go to HelloFresh.com and use POG Shesez 16 for up to 16 free meals plus 3 surprise gifts across 6 HelloFresh boxes plus free shipping. Seriously, I chose HelloFresh as a sponsor because I used them as a general consumer before, loved their service, and I will always bring on companies with a product that I believe in. Give them a try. I really don't think there's any way you could possibly regret it. And now let's look inside of character models themselves. Now, I'm not able to look inside of every character model for this game because whenever you're out on the field and battling and stuff like that, there's a fadeaway technique that's used. But a lot of NPCs I was able to look into without any issues whatsoever. And I do need to make it clear before I show off all these characters that I look in every character model. There is no discrimination about that. And then there's Jaren here. This character, before you fight General Radahn, you would assume that this is his actual face, but taking the camera inside of his hood can show you that it's in fact a helmet, and that beyond the helmet is just a knapsack for a face. And then there's Fia, which is the deathbed companion. Now, much to the disappointment of some people in my audience, I'm not going to give you a graphic look, but she is basically the only character model in this game that has 2 layers of clothing as well as a layer to this model with no clothing at all. And in fact, apparently, if you were able to kill this character model, the undergarment is something your character can collect and wear. And then there's one of the first characters you meet, Vare. Now what's really interesting about Vare is that his forehead is fully modeled underneath the mask, and if you take the camera through it, you can see there's a marking that you would never be able to see otherwise. And then there's the blindfolded Corrin, and if you take the camera through his blindfold, you can see that he has blue eyes. And also there's this boss fight with Renala. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that she has a whole bunch of minions basically. And when you're in the middle of a fight, you don't really stop to see where exactly they're coming from to revive. But now that I had all the time in the world to just kind of stop and smell the roses here, I noticed that they were coming out of these cradles, and I was kind of curious what that looked like inside the cradle. So you can see the exact moment in which they spawn in and what that animation looks like while they're crawling out. And then these annoying enemies, well, as much as I don't like ever engaging with these things ever, I wanted to see what happens when the character gets sucked into the body of this thing. And as it turns out, it's a little difficult to see, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, if I ever do a part 2 of this, we can have some heroic modder remove the transparency effect. But if you look very closely, you can see that all that's in there are the limbs that grabbed you in the first place. Your character model disappears. And then for these magicians, you can see that for whatever reason, there's a whole bunch of jewels in the neck of them. Not typical. Like, for example, the pumpkin head has nothing. It's just like a stub for a neck, but there's nothing in the interior of the helmet. But yeah, these guys, for whatever reason, have a whole bunch of crystals stemming from the base of their neck. And then Ronnie the Witch. This is one of the first things I noticed without a special camera. All of her limbs are held together with rope. And if you take the camera inside the model, there's parts of her arms that can't be seen by the player that continue this trend. And I thought that the fire effects in this game looked so great. So what I decided to do was I froze the game footage in a mid-animation of a fire trap. And I decided to look at it from another angle. And when you hit the angle just right, you can kind of see how this effect is pulled off. It's just a series of textures, some of which have a very deliberate angle towards the player. And it's kind of fun to see when you move the camera here, the effect sort of turns on itself. But anyways, with all that said, let's do a zoom out of another area since this game is so incredibly massive. Alright, let's start talking about environments. The first thing I want to talk about is this Colosseum here. I was really surprised after playing through the game personally in my own time that this giant jar that's in the way doesn't ever let you through to this Colosseum. Instead, you fight 3 of his minions, and then he gives you a little prize for killing all 3 minions, but he never lets you into the Colosseum, which makes this the last piece of footage that I caught for this episode, because it wasn't until last night of this recording that I realized that inside this Colosseum that seems to never get used, there was a lot of interior environment. As you already saw as I'm explaining everything here, we just passed through a hallway that the player never gets to see, and then when you get to the outside of that hallway, there's an open Colosseum. Now, there are 2 lifts that this Colosseum has. There's one on the left, and then there's one all the way to the right. And going inside of those lifts will show you that there is nothing down below, which indicates that this is either incomplete or we can't get the full model to load in. And we're looking at a slightly reduced level of detail. Also, in the center of the Colosseum, there seems to be some sort of platform or altar, and what this was all used for, we may never know. I'm sure there's going to be DLC though. Just the fact that there's lifts there indicates to me that at some point we're going to get additional content, and those lifts are going to go to what the actual content is. Also, if you weren't paying attention, I gave you a little bonus there on the way in. It was the inside of the giant jar. You can see exactly what's going on in there. This is a viewer request. As always, you can give me suggestions for future episodes, as well as giving me suggestions for episodes I'm working on. But anyways, one of the most popular requests was to do a zoom out of the subterranean shunning grounds. Players often feel completely turned around because the environments seem to be identical to one another as you're storming through it, leaving a sense to the player that they're reusing the environment. Well, in one sense they are. They're copying and pasting certain aspects of the environment, but if you take the camera out, you can see that regardless of the fact that it looks similar, it's actually just a giant catacomb of rooms and hallways, and that the similarities are stacked on top of one another. Now we're going to take a zoom out of the round table. And much to my surprise, there's actually exterior modeling when you take the camera out of bounds. Now, it's still in its own separate loading zone, but it seems it was built for the overworld map first, and then all the geometry was copy and pasted into a separate area. Even the forbidden door that the player never gets to open still has a bit of its outdoor modeling remaining, including boxes and barrels. However, walking off of those steps is not going to reward you with an area loaded in. Instead, you're just going to keep falling indefinitely into the void. And I know there was a lot of interest in seeing the Erd tree from different angles as well. Well, I can tell you that the Erd tree is freaking massive, like super huge. So I know there's no illusionary perspective as far as that goes, but taking the camera all the way to the top of the Erd tree can show you where the center portion ends, as well as show you a couple of non-yellow branches. Yeah, there's just some normal looking branches up here, which is pretty bizarre. And then occasionally on the overworld map, you'll see some half-sunken ships off in the distance. This one's to the east of Radahn's battleground. And taking the camera up close can show you that the sails of the ship have a wooden texture to them, which is honestly kind of hilarious. But more surprising than that is that taking the camera underneath the water level can show you that at the very least this one ship is fully modeled. Also, it should come as no surprise that when you're in certain parts of a map, other portions don't fully load in to save on resources. Well, standing outside of the boss room and taking the camera all the way to the back where you would exit the boss room can show you that the back ends of some of these buildings are completely untextured. Now granted, when you get back there, those walls will load in. It's just fascinating to see that there's a stand-in where I'd expect there to be none at all. And I found this to be really unusual. Like I said earlier, Elden Ring is normally a very tight-ridden ship. Not a lot of assets tucked away, but taking the camera underneath this room here with the coffins can show you an unused elevator or well type space. Then later in the game, you find this underground area, and you take an elevator shaft all the way down in order to get here. And I was curious as to what happens when you take the elevator back up. What does the game do to save on resources? Does it just immediately unload everything? Well, surprisingly, not everything just completely unloads. It gets clouded and fogged because of the biome of the above ground area, and a lot of the more sophisticated geometry just disappears. But a lot of the ground seems to stay behind, as well as some rubbles and bases for pillars. Also, this is very relevant for people that love Dark Souls all the way forward. How big can the fog gate get in Elden Ring? Well, here's one example for you. Spinning the camera over while you're in a boss fight can show you that the square for the fog gate has the potential to be utterly massive. So good luck glitching through that. I don't think you have a chance. And then also occasionally you'll see tons and tons of birds up in the sky, and we're going to show you one of my favorite segments on the show, the low poly birds. The low poly birds in Stormvale Castle have a diamond-shaped tail, a pointed beak, and what seems to be 2 layers to its wings. Over for this segment, I just wanted to show you the world's edge, essentially. I'm sure a lot of us are curious about what happens when you take the camera all the way past into the ocean, and eventually the water just simply stops, which is very neat. And then while I was doing that, I decided, hey, why don't we go take a look at some of the environments that are way off in the distance. And here's an example for you of Stormvale Castle at the lowest level of detail setting. Now there is low poly versions of Stormvale Castle that at least has some textures to it that resembles the stone bricks and everything else, but at this stage, it's some super low res brown texture that they just layered over everything. And I guess appropriately, here's a zoom out of Stormvale Castle, giving you a little bit of a look at how the area is loaded in when you're doing your boss fight against Margit. Alright, and the last thing we're going to be talking about is cutscenes. Now, again, there isn't going to be cutscenes that are too far into the game because I'm not too far into the game, but here's a couple of things that I thought looked kind of interesting, starting with this dedicated cutscene for a bridge being raised. I was really surprised by this. Not by what you're about to see, but more so about the fact that they made a dedicated cutscene for raising a bridge. So in the lower right-hand corner, you're seeing the vanilla footage, and what you're mostly seeing on top of the screen here is how that bridge looks being raised without any cutaways or anything like that. So you can kind of see that the bridge kind of shifts a little bit off its track when you see it from an angle you're not supposed to. It's honestly really great. You think for something as simple as animating a bridge being lifted up, you would just have an animation of that bridge lifting up and then you would just change the angles of it. But it seems that the bridge's animation serves the camera shots rather than the other way around. And then this one was suggested to me by Lance McDonald. He has his own video out, by the way. I'll leave a link to his video about some unused beta content. I also got to get him on the show at some point. Anyways, it's one of the first cutscenes of the game, and at a certain point, for whatever reason, the protagonist's head gets crushed in. It's a little hard to see because this cutscene in particular uses a little bit of defocus, and there's just no way to disable that right now. But all the same, it is interesting that outside of the boundaries, your main character's head looks about as good as it's supposed to look after you lost that boss. Then people on my Twitch chat wanted me to look inside of a sarcophagus that's used as a warp, essentially, and see what happens during that cutscene. And the trick that's used here is that as soon as the coffin starts moving, that's when the game calls out or unloads the player model. And I'm going to give you a zoom out here and tell you thanks. If you like Out of Bounds content, this channel is essentially dedicated to it, with only deviating occasionally for content that would be equally interesting to someone that would like Out of Bounds content. So basically what I'm saying is that you won't be disappointed if you follow future content. And of course, it's only a recommendation. I'm just more thankful that you watched this video. So I'm going to keep playing more Elden Ring. That's why this took so long in the first place. I'm addicted. And good night.